Greetings, class. This lecture is on Chapter 31, Section 1, which is the aftermath of World War II in Europe. The main idea of this lecture is how the Allied nations, so the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, had trouble determining how best to keep peace in Europe once the war had ended. During this lecture, we'll start to see the breakup of this powerful alliance in the beginning of the Cold War, where it was the United States versus the Soviet Union. Throughout World War II, there will be several wartime conferences where the leaders of each of the Allied countries came together and met to discuss war strategy and solutions to future problems after the war. The main people that met were called the Big Three. They'd be the guys photographed below. So Winston Churchill is one of the Big Three. He's the Prime Minister of Great Britain. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is the President of the United States. And Premier Joseph Stalin is the leader of the Soviet Union. The first time they met and at their first wartime conference was in Tehran, which is the capital of Iran. And it was at this meeting that they agreed to create a second front to fight Germany. And this was the best way to defeat Germany. So this is where they outlined and mapped out the ideas for Operation Overlord and the invasion of D-Day and Normandy. The second time that these Big Three met was in Yalta. And this took place a couple months before the war came to an end in Europe. And so when they came together, they knew that quite shortly the war would be over and they need to start figuring out true solutions to fixing Europe and what to do with Germany. So that was the focus of their discussions. And they agreed on two things. One, that they should divide and occupy Germany with their militaries. Germany would be divided into four different regions, and the United States would govern one region, Britain would govern another, the Soviets would govern their own, and also France would get to govern a region. And they would govern and control these regions until a government and the economy was stable that could run itself. They also agreed that there should be free elections for all the countries that were conquered by Germany and the Nazis, as well as the countries that were conquered by the Soviet Union, and that people get to vote and decide what kind of government they wanted to have. Now, where this gets sticky is that free elections meant different things to each of the Big Three. Churchill and FDR interpreted free elections as soon as the war is over, people in these conquered countries get to vote and decide what kind of government they want, no ifs, ands, or buts. To Stalin, he viewed this as there needs to be a delay in the elections because he wanted the countries nearest the Soviet Union to be friendly to the Soviet Union. And the only way that they could do that was either if they became communists themselves or they became well-versed in communist principles. So he wanted to delay elections and teach communist principles to these countries and then have them vote on what kind of government they wanted to have. And during this teaching phase, the Soviets would have their military there influencing society. So it really wouldn't have been a fair lesson. The other thing that they all agreed upon was that they needed to create a stronger international peacekeeping organization than the League of Nations. And so FDR proposed the United Nations, which would be a collective security group that would have more military power and economic power to manage international crises and to prevent another conflict. So it's essentially a better, stronger version of the League of Nations is the United Nations. And that is still around today and is still very influential. For the third time that there's a peace conference, it actually took place after Germany had already been defeated, and two of the Big Three were no longer in power. Joseph Stalin was still in charge. He's the Soviet premier. He's of a communist country, so he wasn't going anywhere. But FDR had passed away, and so he was replaced by his former vice president, Harry S. Truman. So this is his first big meeting. And then Winston Churchill had been voted out of power and was no longer the prime minister of England, and instead a guy named Clement Attlee was. So there was a massive power change at this meeting. And Stalin really took advantage of these new people that came to kind of boss and bully them around and to not really honor the previous agreements that were made at the Yalta Conference. At the Potsdam Conference, they made several agreements. This is called Potsdam because it takes place in the German city of Potsdam. One, they agree that they will have a temporary division of Germany. So they're going to follow through where they divide Germany in those four regions. And then eventually they would unify them together to make a unified Germany again. They also agreed that Germany should be demilitarized and that they should not be allowed to build up their military for a period of time until the country was stable enough to begin building up again. They outlawed the Nazi Party, and it was illegal to be part of that political group because of what they did during World War II and the years prior. They also believe that democracy should take place in Germany, and that's what they should be using to vote and determine what kind of government they wanted. And that the war criminals from World War II, in particular the leaders of the final solution and of the Holocaust, should be put on trial and should be brought to justice. Some of the results of this meeting was that Stalin claimed that a lot of the lands that the Soviet Union had conquered from Germany, that the Soviet Union needed to keep and wanted to give to some of the newly created countries in the area. And so as a result, Germany lost a lot of its land. It lost about a quarter of its land that it had gained access to and controlled to its east. Germans living in that land were also evicted and kicked out and sent to what's left of the current state of Germany, which put a lot of population pressures on Germany. Consider that Germany had just lost the war, their economy's poor, and now they've lost land, and people living in that land have been moved to the country where there's a lack of jobs. So they had a lot of issues going on because of what Stalin was doing. Also, the Soviet Union began to demand reparations. They felt like they should be getting money and aid from Germany for all the damage caused by the war, whereas Britain and the United States felt like there was no need for reparations because they were so terrible, their effects after World War I. And so the Soviet Union ended up taking reparations from the eastern part of Germany, whereas the western part was able to continue on without paying any reparations at all. This is going to have a very negative effect on the development of Eastern Germany. And then finally, they set up the basis for the Nuremberg trials. These were the trials for the war criminals from World War II, in particular, the leaders of the Holocaust and of the final solution. And they were brought on trial in front of an international court. And many of them were found guilty. A couple were acquitted. But it was an answer to the world for how do you bring justice to the horrors of something like a genocide without resorting to murder yourself. And it was using these international trials in this court. The Nuremberg trials have since become a standard for other types of international episodes where there's genocide and human rights violations taking place. After the Potsdam Conference, the leaders of the world followed through and ended up creating the United Nations, which they had agreed upon at the Yalta Conference. And the purpose of the United Nations was to maintain peace and security, and then to foster international cooperation and to solve cultural, economic, and social problems. So again, a stronger version of the League of Nations. The United Nations has multiple divisions within it and multiple groups, but the two most important branches or parts of the United Nations are the General Assembly and the Security Council. The General Assembly is where you have a representative from all member countries. So if you're part of the United Nations, every country gets a member to this. And if you're part of the General Assembly, you have equal voting power and equal rights. And you basically decide what the budget's going to be. You elect a Secretary General, so a leader of the meetings and court judges. And you kind of get to share your opinion and voice many different things. So you're kind of the average participant. But there's also the Security Council. And the Security Council is made up of 15 member countries. There are 10 temporary members to the Security Council. And there's also 5 permanent members to the Security Council. Those permanent members are the 5 strongest countries in the world. They are France, China, Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union during this time. And the Security Council exists because there was a belief that there needed to be some members of the United Nations that had more power and more control. And these people would be the ones that could control the discussions and ended up wielding the most power and votes. All 5 permanent members of the Security Council also had the ability to veto. So the League of Nations was going to go act and do something, and one of those 5 countries vetoed and voted no. The veto is the ability to defeat a measure with a single vote. They could stop the United Nations from acting. So it was a more organized and powerful version of the League of Nations, but there were still some things in there that kind of kept countries from being able to do whatever they wanted, which would be the veto power. Finally, after the Potsdam Conference, trouble between the United States and the Soviet Union started to brew. The Soviet Union began to build a buffer of communist countries along its border. So this map right here, we see the Soviet Union in red, and these dark red areas are areas that Russia controls. These pink areas here are countries that the Soviet Union had moved their military into had said they'd given free elections to, but really they hadn't given free elections, and were communist countries that supported the Soviet Union. They're Soviet allies. And these pink countries acted as a buffer state. They were like a separating barrier between the rest of Europe, which was democratic, and communist Soviet Union. And they're often called satellite countries, these countries that are around the Soviet Union because they're really small. Russia's so big, and satellites are small objects that orbit a larger object. And so we see the development of this buffer here of these communist countries. And eventually this will be called an Iron Curtain that kind of separates democratic Western Europe and communist Eastern Europe. And this is going to be very upsetting to a lot of people that are from the Western countries and from the United States, because they're going to see what's happening with these pink Soviet ally countries and go, well, they never had free elections. They were forced to become communists. And this is a clear violation of what was agreed upon at the Yalta Conference. And then the second thing that kind of happens that sort of sets the stage for the Cold War is that because of political economic disagreements between the Soviet Union and their actions with these Eastern European countries and the United States and Britain, Germany never actually gets unified until a much later date. And we end up getting a Eastern Germany and a Western Germany. This map right here shows how Germany was divided. So we have the 4 different military districts, and the flag by them shows which country controlled each district. And the green, blue, and yellow do join together, and they make Western Germany. And all 3 of those regions practice democracy and make a democratic capitalist government and economy. But this red section is the one that's under the Soviet Union's influence, and they're going to become a communist country because Russia's going to force it upon them. And so that's why we get an East Germany, one that's under Soviet influence and is communist, and a West Germany, one that is under, democratic powers and capitalist economy with a little bit more freedom to grow. These satellite countries and this division of Germany is going to be some of the early events that take place and happen during our next major event, the Cold War.